On this Sunday, when we honor those who work in healthcare and human service, we find two healing passages, two healing stories in our passages from John 4 and 5. One in Cana and the next in Jerusalem. Cana, if you will remember, is where Jesus turned the water into wine at a wedding back in chapter 2. John doesn't do anything by accident. So when we see that this story takes place also in Cana, we should pay attention to any possible parallels between it and the other story about the wedding. And there are several of these parallels. In both stories, we have someone who makes a request of Jesus. His mother wants him to do something about the wine that is running low. The royal official wants him to come up to his home and heal his son. In both stories, Jesus appears reluctant to act and even issues what could be considered a rebuke. He tells his mom, basically, "Leave me out of this, Mom. It's not my time yet." And in response to the official's request, he says, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe," which incidentally is addressed to a broader audience than just this one man. Unless y'all see signs and wonders. In both stories, the petitioners persist. His mother tells the servants to do whatever Jesus says, and the royal official says, "Sir, come down before my little boy dies." In both stories, Jesus performs an act that fulfills their requests, although perhaps not in a way they had envisioned. At the wedding, the water of purification becomes excellent wine, and Jesus heals the official's son without taking a single step in the direction of his house. In both stories, the response is that someone believes. In the wedding story, it's his disciples, while in the healing story, it's the official, along with his whole household. And finally, John calls both stories signs, his word for what we might call miracles, whose purpose it is to illuminate who Jesus is. It's clear that John wants us to consider these two stories together, and there are several lessons we can derive from these similarities, some of which will also relate to the next story about the healing of the man in Jerusalem. One lesson is that Jesus brings life. He turns the flat water of purification rite into the joyous wine of the commonwealth of God. He brings back a child from the brink of death. In the second Cana story, John records twice that Jesus says, "Your son will live." But a better translation of the Greek clause, which is in present tense, would be, "Your son lives." It's no stretch to imagine that John wants us to think not only of the sick boy, but also of Jesus himself. The Son, capital S, lives. As an announcement of the resurrection here in chapter 4. It's also no accident that the wedding and Jesus' first sign takes place on the third day. The theme of resurrection is woven all throughout the Gospel of John. It is present in the second healing story as well, if only obliquely. If you read on past verse 18, you will find that the controversy that ensues from the healing incident centers around the concept of resurrection. In verse 21, Jesus says, "Just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to anyone he chooses." And the Greek word for raises is a form of the same word Jesus uses when he tells the lame man to stand up, take your mat, and walk. Jesus is the bringer of life, resurrection life. And boy, does this character need resurrected. Jesus encounters him outside the sheep gate that leads into the temple, lying on his mat near the pool of Bethesda. In contrast to the royal official who seeks out Jesus with his urgent request for healing, in this case, Jesus is the initiator. It's as though he has come seeking this man out. Let's pause for a second and consider what Jesus is doing here. He has come to Jerusalem for an undesignated festival of the Jews, as John calls it. That means he's a pilgrim, having come up with the throngs from Galilee, probably, Folks who grow more excited every day as they draw closer to the holy city until finally they round a corner or top a hill and see that magnificent alabaster and gold holy place shining in the sun. And a spontaneous cheer breaks out. Everybody is eager to get to the temple to experience all the sights and sounds and smells of their nation at worship. But where is Jesus? We find him outside the gates, in the midst of the dregs of society, invalids whom John describes as blind, lame, and paralyzed. Driftwood that is washed up on the shore of life and that goes ignored by almost everyone. But not Jesus. He walks in their midst, just as he still walks today in the hallways, the waiting rooms, the ICUs of hospitals. Or he squats next to the young girl shooting up in the damp alley. Or he visits the home of a grieving mother whose only child has just been killed in a drive-by shooting. These are the kinds of places Jesus frequented then and still frequents now. These invalids indeed resemble Driftwood. They have gathered near the pool of Bethesda because a cruel legend, which does not appear in the text, but you may have seen it as a footnote in your Bible. There's a cruel legend that says from time to time an angel comes and stirs up the water of the pool. And if you are able to get into that living water while it's still moving, you will be healed. It's the last stop for the incurable, the last fading glimmer of hope. I call the legend cruel because the hope it offers is a false hope. Even if the story of the angel is true, it's not those most in need who get in, but rather those who have some kind of advantage. Maybe they are not entirely immobilized, or they have friends to help them down into the pool, or they have a small bit of power and influence and are able to take their place right next to the steps leading down into the waters. Kind of like our healthcare system, where if you have the money, you can get better quality health insurance. Or you can afford the expensive medications whose prices the pharmaceutical companies jack up even higher without warning just because they can. As Bono once observed, don't believe it when they tell me there ain't no cure. The rich stay healthy, the sick stay poor. As he walks among this driftwood of humanity, Jesus' eyes settle on one particular person. I'm going to pick on you, Tom. With one look, you can tell that this man has occupied his spot for a long, long time. As a matter of fact, John tells us the guy has been ill for 38 years. Can you imagine? This man is utterly alone. No family, no friends. I'm sorry, Tom. No family, no friends, not a single person to give him a second glance. He might as well be a piece of furniture. The sofa that has sat in the same spot in your mother-in-law's living room for so long that you don't really see it anymore. I mean, you see it, it's there, sometimes you even sit on it, but you don't notice it, and you haven't for a long time. We can easily imagine that the lame man has over the years come to think of himself as a piece of furniture too. He is so used to being ignored that it takes him a full minute even to realize that somebody has spoken to him. With effort, he turns his attention to the speaker, but the guy is backlit, and he can't make out his features clearly. Come again, he says, still not convinced he was being addressed. I said, the man says slowly and clearly, do you want to get well? This is no idle question. Jesus recognizes with only a glance that the lame man has given up. To lie in the same spot for nearly 40 years without finding some way to get into the pool is only possible for one whose will has atrophied just as surely as his legs have. In response to Jesus' question, the man can only make a feeble excuse. Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me. Here's another indictment of the cruel legend of the angel. The healing is limited. When the angel troubles the waters, it's on an unpredictable schedule, and then it's first come, first served, and not many get served on any occasion. It's a combination lottery and festival seating arrangement. And those who are luckier or stronger or more ruthless end up with seats close to the stage, while the ones who really need to get inside never even make it to the doors of the concert hall. And this happens over and over again. Enough times of missing out, and see if your will does not atrophy also. What the man doesn't know yet is that Jesus is just as capable of resurrecting his will as he is of healing his limbs. The man doesn't need to wait for the waters to be stirred because the source of living water is standing right in front of him. Living water that gushes up to eternal life. Jesus is not wasting time with the man's excuses. He knows them for what they are. But instead, he says simply, stand up, take your mat, and walk. And waits to see if the man can will himself to obey. Again, note that the word translated as stand up is the same word used in relation to the resurrection. There is more to this encounter than what we see on the surface. In the Gospel of John, there is always more to the story. The man has been sick for 38 years, which incidentally corresponds with the time the Israelites spent wandering in the wilderness after the Exodus. So the man represents Israel, just as those 6 stone water jars at the wedding in Cana represented Israel's religious traditions. We know what he did with that water. Now we see what he can do with this lame man. John writes, at once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Jesus has come to renew the covenant between Israel and God, and if it comes to it, he will create an entirely new covenant, signified by new wine and by a man whose will to live and flourish has been raised from the dead. The story does not end on this happy note, however, because of the next sentence, which John drops in almost as an afterthought. Now that day was a Sabbath. As if on cue, as if specifically designed to prove John's point about Israel's need for resurrection, a group of Jewish authorities come down hard on the man for carrying his cot on the Sabbath. These are the busybodies, the gatekeepers that we have in every religion, hall monitors, I call them, who have appointed themselves to check your hall pass and make sure you are where you belong and you're not doing anything you're not supposed to do. Their faces always seem pinched, as though they've been sucking on a lemon. And their minds and hearts are pinched to match. This guy has been ill for 38 years and now is well, and all they can do is nitpick about his supposedly violating the Sabbath. As the NFL guys on ESPN like to say, come on, man! After an investigation of the matter, they learn it was Jesus who healed the man. But instead of marveling at his power or commending him for his act of mercy, they start persecuting him because he is doing such things on the Sabbath. Jesus responds to their narrow-minded objections by saying, my Father is still working, and I also am working. The hall monitors don't care for that one much either. And they begin seeking to kill Jesus because he is not only breaking the Sabbath, but is also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God. Well, dummies, all you had to do was look at the healing itself to see proof that Jesus is equal to God. Or better, that he obeys and performs God's will perfectly while always remaining subservient to God. Because God is still working even on the Sabbath, Jesus too must keep working. And so must we. As Jesus will make clear later in John's Gospel, we are to emulate Jesus just as Jesus emulates God. To return to a theme from a few weeks ago, we are to incarnate Jesus in the world today just as Jesus incarnated God in first century Palestine. Now that doesn't mean that we necessarily have healing powers per se, But it does mean we can follow Jesus' example in other ways. Remember where we found Jesus after he returned to Jerusalem? Walking among the driftwood, the junkies and the basket cases, the incurably ill and those trodden down by life so much that even their will to live, to be human, is all but dead. So who are the driftwood that we encounter in our everyday lives? Is it the guy who stands near the off-ramp of the highway holding the sign that says, "Homeless veteran, please help"? Is it an older person who lives in assisted living and is hard to interact with because of her dementia, but who has no family or friends in the area, no one to come and visit her? Is it the single mother working 2 jobs and still dependent on SNAP benefits and WIC and the food pantry to get her through each month? Is it the teenager who has come out as transgender, whose Bible-believing parents have kicked her out of the house and who now is couch surfing or else living on the street? Is it a construction worker who fell off a ladder 3 years ago and became hooked on painkillers, an addiction that has progressed now to heroin and fentanyl? Is it the parents who have to sit their sons down around age 12 or 13 and give them the talk, explaining how they must behave when they invariably get stopped by the cops, a talk they find humiliating yet necessary, accompanied by a crippling anxiety whenever their boys go out of the house? Or is it somebody else who doesn't fit any of these categories, but who is still adrift and in need of somebody to be their friend, to offer extravagant welcome, to incarnate Jesus for them? Once we have identified that driftwood person in our lives, let us then ask a second question. Do we want to get well? Because our healing is inextricably bound up in the healing of others. We cannot be whole if these others are not also whole. So, imagine yourself on the mat, paralyzed, unable to drag yourself to the pool for healing, abandoned by everyone, and suddenly Jesus appears before you, backlit, and says, "Do you want to be made well?"